We're terminating your position, effective immediately. The future is a more agile, cloud-native paradigm. Those were the words. Polished, meaningless, delivered from across a vast mahogany table that smelled faintly of lemon oil and condescension. They thought that would be the end of the story. They thought they could unplug 22 years of my life like some obsolete peripheral. They were wrong. My name is Larry Thompson. I'm 49 years old, and until that moment, I was the Senior Business Systems Analyst at LogiCore Solutions. In reality, I was the company's central nervous system. I designed, built, and maintained the operational software that ran every single aspect of the business. It was called Prometheus, and it was my life's work. The man firing me, the one using words like paradigm, had been with the company for 6 months. His name was Julian Croft. He sat there, radiating the unearned confidence of a man who got his education from a brochure and his management style from a TED Talk. He was 34, with a jawline that belonged on a recruitment poster and a $2,000 Brioni suit that looked stiff and unnatural. He gestured vaguely with a manicured hand. Of course, we'll need the complete source code and all associated assets for Prometheus. We're bringing in a consulting team, Innovatech, to manage the data migration to the new SAP platform. We need a seamless transition. My heart wasn't pounding. My hands weren't shaking. A strange, dead calm settled over me. It was the same feeling I got when a critical server failed at 3 CHAM. The panic gets you killed, but the process saves you. I looked at Julian, then at the 2 other executives in the room, both of whom suddenly found the grain of the mahogany intensely fascinating. They wouldn't meet my eye. I nodded slowly. You'll have the source code repository by the end of the day. Julian smiled, a tight, dismissive little thing. Excellent. We appreciate your cooperation in making this a smooth process. He slid a folder across the table. My severance package. A pathetic, legally mandated minimum. He hadn't just fired me. He had insulted me. But here's what Julian didn't know. The source code was just the what. Millions of lines of elegant, efficient instructions that told the system what to do. He never thought to ask for the why. He had the car, the keys, and a full tank of gas. But he didn't have the blueprints for the engine, the wiring diagrams, or the owner's manual. He didn't have the business logic. And that was everything. If you enjoy stories about corporate karma and how quiet competence always beats loud arrogance, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I've seen firsthand how people who build things are underestimated by people who just talk about them, and I'll be bringing you new stories every week that show exactly what happens when that bill comes due. I started at LogiCore Solutions in 2002. Back then, it wasn't a $50 million logistics company. It was 5 guys in a sweltering garage in Austin, Texas, with a good idea and not much else. The founder, Arthur Vance, was a brilliant old-school trucker who understood supply chains better than anyone on the planet. I was 27, fresh out of the Army, where I'd spent 6 years in communications and signals intelligence. I knew how to make systems talk to each other under pressure. Arthur hired me to build a better way to track shipments. We started with a simple database. Over the next 2 decades, as the company grew, that simple database evolved. It became Prometheus. It wasn't just a piece of software. It was a digital clone of Arthur's brain, translated into code by my hands. It handled inventory, billing, scheduling, payroll, fleet maintenance, and customer relations. It was all interconnected, a single, monolithic entity that was the beating heart of LogiCore. Prometheus wasn't just code, it was a complex web of deeply embedded business logic. For example, our system could automatically adjust our shipping quotes based on the futures market for diesel fuel. If a hurricane was forecast in the Gulf of Mexico, it would reroute trucks scheduled to pass through the area 2 days before the storm was projected to make landfall. simultaneously notifying clients of the potential for a minor delay while rebooking the driver's motels on the new route. It cross-referenced union overtime rules with state labor laws to optimize payroll, saving the company over $800,000 a year in compliance fees and penalties. These weren't just features I bolted on. They were solutions to real-world problems, developed over 20 years of late nights and weekends. I missed my daughter Sarah's 8th birthday party in 2011 because a glitch in a new module was triple billing our biggest client. I spent Christmas Eve of 2015 rewriting the entire inventory management kernel from scratch after a server fire wiped out our primary data center. My wife, Helen, used to joke that Prometheus was my first child. She wasn't entirely wrong. I put my life into that system. The company's success was built on its stability, its intelligence, its seamless operation. My stability, my intelligence. Then, 11 months ago, Arthur Vance's health took a turn. He was forced to retire, selling his 72% ownership stake to a private equity firm, Sterling Capital. The first thing Sterling did was install a new board. The second was to hire Julian Croft as Chief Information Officer, a position that hadn't existed before. Julian's mandate was simple: modernize the company and prepare it for a sale in 3 to 5 years. From our first meeting, I knew he was a problem. He walked into my office, which was more of a server-filled cave than a corporate suite, and looked around with a faint air of disgust. He saw my worn-out jeans, my 1985 F-150 in the parking lot, and my lack of an Ivy League degree, and he made an assessment. He saw me as a relic, a piece of legacy infrastructure that needed to be replaced. "So, this Prometheus system," he said, tapping on his iPad. "It's all custom, right? In-house build?" "From the ground up," I confirmed. "No documentation, I assume," he said. It wasn't a question. "There's documentation," I replied calmly. He waved a hand dismissively. "Right. Well, we can't have our entire $50 million operation dependent on one person's tribal knowledge. We need scalable, off-the-shelf solutions. Best-in-class enterprise software. We're migrating to SAP." He used words like synergy and optimization and digital transformation. To him, Prometheus was just a tangled mess of custom code. He never once asked what it did or how it worked. He couldn't see the forest for the trees. But worse, he didn't even know he was in a forest. He thought he was looking at a single, inconvenient shrub. The breaking point came in February 2020. I knew for sure 3 weeks ago. That's when I saw the signed contract with Innovatech on the server, a $1.8 million deal to oversee the migration. My fate was sealed. But as I sat in that conference room, absorbing the final blow, my mind went back to a conversation from over a decade earlier. Back in 2013, Arthur Vance was getting ready to step back from day-to-day operations. One evening, he called me into his office. He poured 2 glasses of Macallan 18. He looked tired, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Larry," he said, handing me a glass, "you and I, we built this place. But you're the one who gave it a brain. Prometheus. That's not just a tool. It's the whole damn company." I just nodded, unsure where he was going. "I'm bringing in some new blood," he continued. "Guys with MBAs who talk a different language. They're going to look at you and this system, and they won't understand it. They'll see it as a risk because they can't buy it out of a box." He took a long sip of the scotch. "Son, this system is your soul. I want you to protect it. Protect yourself. The code belongs to the company. I get that. But the logic, the why behind it all, that's yours. That came from your head. I want you to document it. Document the business reasons for every decision, every algorithm, every connection. Write it down like you're explaining it to a smart 5th grader, and you keep that documentation for yourself. It's your intellectual property. Don't store it on a company server. Keep it separate. Keep it safe. One day, some suit who can't change his own oil will try to take it from you, and that binder will be your shield and your sword. I took his advice. I started that very night. I called the project the Vance Protocols. For the next 10 years, on my own time, on my personal MacBook Pro, I documented everything. I created flowcharts, decision trees, and detailed explanations for every single module. I explained why a purchase order for steel rebar in Ohio triggered an inventory alert for shipping pallets in our Galveston warehouse, because the rebar was for a construction project that would require specialized pallets we sourced from a single supplier near that port. I detailed the algorithm that adjusted our pricing based on the Baltic Dry Index, a key indicator of global shipping costs. It grew into 12 volumes, over 3,000 pages in total. It was the Rosetta Stone for Prometheus. It was the why. And it was sitting in a fireproof safe in my home office. Julian Croft had no idea it existed. The stakes for me were immense. My retirement was tied up in stock options that wouldn't fully vest for another 3 years. My reputation, built over 2 decades, was being tossed in the trash. I had a second mortgage on my house to help my son David get through engineering school at Texas A&M. Losing this job wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a potential catastrophe. After leaving the office for the last time, I didn't rage. I didn't drink. I went home, sat down at my desk, and began to work. My response had to be methodical, precise, and professional. I was a systems analyst, and this was now the most critical system I'd ever have to manage. First, I called my lawyer, Evelyn Reed. She was a sharp, no-nonsense IP attorney I'd consulted years ago on Arthur's advice. I explained the situation. Her response was immediate and clear. Do not give them anything other than what they specifically requested. The source code is theirs. The business logic documentation, created on your own time and equipment, is yours. Let them make the next move. Next, I started my own documentation project. I created a secure, time-stamped log of every relevant event. Julian's termination speech, the official termination letter, the Innovatec contract I'd found. I took screenshots of Julian's LinkedIn profile, where he was already posting updates about spearheading a bold digital transformation at Logicor and using hashtags like Chalkdirt Leadership and Alm Innovation. It was a masterclass in corporate self-aggrandizement. He was building my case for me. Julian, flush with his victory, moved quickly. He believed he had already won. The very next week, he held a company-wide town hall meeting. A junior colleague, who still felt a sense of loyalty to me, sent me a clandestine recording. In it, Julian stood on a stage, a picture of modern executive confidence. As we move forward into a new era of growth, he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the large warehouse space, we must shed the legacy systems that have been holding us back. Our previous platform, while functional for its time, was a tangled mess of custom code with zero documentation. It created an unacceptable key man dependency. He was talking about me. Our new partnership with SAP and Innovatec will provide us with a robust, scalable, and fully documented system that will serve us for years to come. He had just lied to the entire company, and I had the recording to prove it. He was arrogant, overconfident, and so sure of my irrelevance that he didn't even consider the possibility that I had prepared for this exact scenario. He never bothered to check his assumptions. He assumed the code was all that mattered. He assumed a 49-year-old analyst in faded jeans couldn't possibly outmaneuver a 34-year-old Wharton MBA. That was his critical error. I didn't have to do anything. I just had to wait. My value to that company was like the foundation of a building, invisible, unglamorous, but absolutely essential. And Julian had just taken a sledgehammer to it, convinced he could replace it with a decorative welcome mat. The collapse was inevitable. It was just a matter of when. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened. The system, my Prometheus, continued to run flawlessly. It was designed for stability. Julian grew even more confident. The Innovatech team, a group of sharp-dressed consultants who were half my age and had twice my salary, swarmed the IT department. They had the source code, millions of lines of it. They held meetings, created PowerPoint decks, and talked about sprint cycles and agile workflows. They were mapping the old database fields to the new SAP system. I knew what they were seeing. They were looking at clean, well-structured code. But it was like looking at a map of a city without any street names or building labels. They could see the connections, but they had no idea what they meant. Why did the fleet maintenance module communicate with the commodities pricing API? Why did the payroll system query the weather data server? To them, it was random, nonsensical. To Prometheus, it was logic. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after my termination. It was a minor tremor. The automated inventory system started issuing phantom purchase orders for warehouse supplies. It was a small bug, something I would have fixed in 15 minutes. The Innovatech team spent 4 days trying to find the source of the problem, finally resorting to a clumsy patch that fixed the symptom but not the cause. I knew what had happened. They had optimized a server, decommissioning a small, seemingly redundant data feed that provided information on regional shipping delays. They didn't know that Prometheus used that feed as a check balance to verify logistics chain integrity before ordering new supplies. Without that data, the system assumed inventory was being depleted faster than it was, and tried to compensate. The real chaos began on the first of the month, the first quarterly billing cycle. This was the big one. Prometheus's billing module was my masterpiece. It handled thousands of invoices, each with complex, client-specific discount structures, fuel surcharges, and tiered pricing. It was a symphony of interconnected data points. On Monday morning, the system generated and sent out every invoice for the previous quarter. And it was a catastrophe. A major client, a national hardware chain worth $12 million a year in revenue, received a bill for $117 million. A bug triggered by the Innovatech team's earlier patch had caused the system to misinterpret a decimal point in their discount structure. The client's CFO was on the phone, screaming, within the hour. Simultaneously, the automated payroll system, which I had painstakingly calibrated to handle our drivers' complex union contracts, miscalculated overtime for nearly 400 employees. It underpaid them by an average of 12%. This wasn't just an error, it was a breach of their collective bargaining agreement. The Teamsters filed a formal grievance that afternoon. The company ground to a halt. The phones in accounting were ringing off the hook with angry clients. The warehouse floor was buzzing with angry drivers. The entire logistics chain was frozen because billing and payroll, the two systems that powered the flow of money and labor, were broken. From my home office, I watched the chaos unfold through the snippets of information I got from my few remaining allies inside the company. Julian, they said, was in full panic mode. He and the Innovatech team were holed up in a conference room, staring at lines of code they couldn't comprehend. They were pilots in a cockpit full of unlabeled buttons, flying blind in a storm. The emergency board meeting was called for that Friday at 10 Chaos a.m. I received my invitation on Thursday evening. It came not from Julian, but from a man named George Cromwell, a board member who had been with the company since the early days and had been a close friend of Arthur Vance. The email was short. Larry, we need you. 10 a.m. tomorrow. Boardroom. I walked into the Logicor headquarters at 9:55 a.m. I was wearing a simple, dark blue suit. A quiet statement. The receptionist looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. Security, the same guards who would have been ordered to escort me out a month ago, nodded respectfully. Word had clearly gotten around. The atmosphere in the boardroom was thick with tension. Julian stood at the head of the table, his face pale and slick with sweat. His expensive suit now looked like a costume. The Innovatech team lead, A young man named Bryce sat beside him, staring intently at his laptop as if it held the secrets to the universe. The board members looked grim. Julian was in the middle of his presentation. He was trying to project confidence, but his voice was strained. So, while we've encountered some unexpected complexities in the legacy architecture, the Innovatech team has developed a path forward. The underlying code is, frankly, a mess of undocumented spaghetti logic. He clicked to a new slide. It was titled Project Phoenix, a 9-month reverse engineering initiative. We propose a 2-phase solution, Julian continued, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual arrogance. Phase 1 will be a complete rollback, which will take about a week. Phase 2 will involve a dedicated team of 6 senior engineers from Innovatech to reverse engineer the core business logic of the old system. The estimated cost is an additional $5 million, but it will ensure a stable and fully documented platform for the future. He thought he had them. He was presenting a massive failure as a new, expensive opportunity. He was blaming the plane he had crashed and offering to sell them a new one at twice the price. That's when I walked in. Every head turned. Julian stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. The color drained from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. George Cromwell broke the silence. Larry, thank you for coming. I nodded to George and walked calmly to the empty chair at the foot of the table, directly opposite Julian. I placed my briefcase on the floor beside me. Mr. Croft, I said, my voice steady and measured. I happened to overhear your last statement. You said Prometheus was undocumented. Julian sputtered. It is. It's a black box. We have the code, but none of the logic is documented. That's not accurate, I said simply. There is documentation. Extensive documentation, in fact. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single, thick, leather-bound binder. The spine was embossed with gold lettering. The Vance Protocols, Volume 1, Core Logic and Billing. I placed it on the mahogany table with a solid, definitive thud. The room held its breath. This, I said, gesturing to the binder, is the business logic specification for Prometheus. Volume 1 of 12. It details the why behind every single line of code you've been struggling with. It explains, in plain English, the operational rules that govern the entire system. It is my personal intellectual property, created on my own time, using my own equipment, as per the direct advice of the company's founder, Arthur Vance. It is not, and has never been, an asset of Logicore Solutions. Julian stared at the binder as if it were a venomous snake. His carefully constructed narrative, his $5 million escape plan, had just evaporated. I continued, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members. The source code you have is a car without an engine. This documentation is the engine. It's the brain. Without it, you are flying blind, and you have already caused significant financial and reputational damage to this company. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then I delivered the terms. I am willing to license the Vance Protocols to Logicore. My terms are non-negotiable. First, an initial licensing and implementation fee of $2.5 million, payable immediately. This will cover the damage control and system stabilization. Second, an ongoing royalty of 5% of the company's net profits, in perpetuity, for the continued use of my intellectual property. Third, a permanent voting seat on this board of directors, effective today. And fourth, I paused, looking directly at Julian Croft, the immediate termination of Mr. Croft for gross negligence, dereliction of duty, and for deliberately misleading this board and the company's employees. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Julian finally found his voice, a panicked squeak. This is extortion. You can't. I'm the CIO. George Cromwell looked at him with cold disdain. Julian, you were the CIO. Your authority ends where catastrophic failure begins. You have 30 minutes to clear out your desk. Security will escort you. The power shift was instantaneous and total. The Innovatech consultant, Bryce, quietly closed his laptop. The other board members, the ones who had avoided my gaze a month ago, were now looking at me with a mixture of awe and terror. They saw me, for the first time, not as a background utility, but as the man who held the company's future in his hands. George called for a vote. It was unanimous. My terms were accepted without a single word of debate. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Julian Croft was escorted from the building by 2 security guards, carrying his belongings in a small cardboard box. His LinkedIn profile was updated by the end of the day. The bold pronouncements about digital transformation were gone, replaced by the sterile, desperate phrase, actively seeking new opportunities. I later heard he was sued by Logicor for the full cost of the Innovatech contract and the damages incurred from the billing and payroll disaster. He ended up losing his house. The $5 million Project Phoenix was canceled. The Innovatech team was dismissed that same afternoon. Their contract was terminated for failure to perform. I spent the weekend in the office, not as an employee, but as a consultant and board member. I brought in 2 of my old, loyal team members, programmers whom Julian had also fired, and paid them a hefty bonus out of my licensing fee. Together, we stabilized Prometheus in 72 hours. By Monday morning, all systems were running perfectly. Corrected invoices were sent out with formal letters of apology, which I drafted myself. The union grievance was settled, with full back pay and penalties paid by the company. The enablers on the board, the executives who had sat silently while Julian fired me, were now my most ardent supporters. They voted yes on every proposal I made. They had seen the abyss, and they knew I was the only one who had pulled them back from the edge. My professional life was transformed. I was no longer the invisible analyst in the basement. I was a board member, a key stakeholder, the man they now called the architect. I used my new position and resources not to rest on my laurels, but to finally modernize Prometheus the right way. Incrementally, thoughtfully, integrating new technologies without gutting the core logic that made the company successful. Profits rose by 35% over the next 2 years. My 5% royalty became a very substantial number. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was personal. The constant stress that had been my companion for 20 years was gone. I was home for dinner every single night. I coached my son David's Little League team. I took my wife, Helen, on that trip to Italy we had been postponing for 15 years. We stood on a balcony in Florence, looking out over the Arno River, and for the first time in my adult life, my mind wasn't on a server rack or a line of code. It was right there, in that moment. One afternoon, I was in the garage, tinkering with my old 1985 F-150. It still runs great, by the way. Some things are worth keeping. David, home from college for the summer, came out to help me. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, just as we had when he was a kid. "Dad," he said finally, wiping grease from his hands. "That whole thing at work. You never got angry. I would have been furious." I stopped and looked at him. "I was angry," I admitted. "But anger is just noise. It doesn't solve the problem. In the Army, they taught us that in a crisis, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall back on your training, your preparation. All those years, I was preparing for a problem I didn't even know I was going to have." For the first time in a long while, I walked out of a boardroom not as an employee, not as a scapegoat, but as the rightful steward of what I had built. My value doesn't disappear just because others can't see it. The work always speaks for itself in the end. You just have to be patient enough to let it have the last word. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. Leave a comment letting me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.